Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about game publishing. You have a game idea and you want to get it made. How do you go about doing that? What does it take to get a game from idea to implementation to distribution? In this lesson, we provide an overview of how a game gets to the stage where you can download it from an app store or game distribution platform like Steam. In this lesson, we will talk about two types of companies: game publishers and game studios. Game studios make the game and game publishers publish them. What does publish mean? We stay tuned, find out. Okay, first we will talk about game publishers. You know the first fancy splash screen that you see when you load up a game? That's probably the publisher's logo. Famous publishers include Sony, Nintendo, Apple, Microsoft, Blizzard, and EA. Essentially, a game publisher is a company that publishes games. The games that they publish may be developed internally by the company itself, or publishers may commission external studios to develop the game. The collaboration between the studio and the publisher may be initiated by either party, meaning that the studio may pitch the game to the publisher to get them to publish the game, or the publisher might approach the studio to offer to publish the game, which might involve buying over some or all the rights to the game. But what does publishing actually mean? The term game publishing encompasses a broad range of responsibilities. The main function of the publisher is to finance the game, which puts them in the role of product owner. And if it is a publicly listed company, then the publisher is answerable to its shareholders. As a result, the publisher will set deadlines and checkpoints based on their risk assessment, and since they control the funding, they will help to determine how that funding will be spent. They also pay for any licenses involved in the development, from software to art and sound assets to intellectual property. Game publishers will often be involved in the QA testing, as they may have a sense of their target audience and be able to suggest improvements to the game. They're also in charge of marketing to players, like holding press conferences, press events, and online advertising, and also sometimes selling directly to players. In the old days, they also manufacture game media, such as burning the software onto DVDs and putting out manuals. But these days, the majority of games are delivered online. Still, very popular games may spawn other media like action figures or like Funko Pop figurines, and publishers will be involved in that process. Speaking of controlling the funding, the amount of funding could be full or partial. Whether the publisher pays for part or all of the development costs depends on a few factors. One is the reputation of the developer or game studio. If the developer or studio has had a lot of previous successes, it shows that they know what they're doing, and their new game will therefore be more likely to succeed. This is especially important when it comes to sequels to successful games. Another factor is the current state of the game or the prototype. If the publisher sees that the game is mostly finished, or they can see that the game has that something special that they believe will make it a hit, they are more likely to invest more to the product. Ultimately, it's all about return on investment. Another important aspect to consider is intellectual property or IP rights. Many games build worlds or create characters that are considered creative products with value that's possibly beyond the actual game. IPs like Harry Potter, Animal Crossing, or Angry Birds can be very valuable as they come with an existing fan base that will be more interested in additional products in that line, whether it's a sequel game, a movie, or even T-shirts. Right? Publishers can allow the studio to retain full or partial IP rights, or even buy over the IP entirely. That being said, some game studios may prefer not to collaborate with a publisher, with all the pros and cons of that decision. All the previous responsibilities such as project management, testing, and marketing still has to be fulfilled, but the studio will take up that responsibility themselves. If they choose not to join up with the publisher, they may fund the project themselves using crowdsourcing like Kickstarter, or maybe look for private investors who may not be full-time publishers. This may even be asking friends and family members to loan them some money during the development process. In the long run, game studios that want independence in their decisions usually do something called bootstrapping. Okay, basically they take the profits of the first game and feed it into the development cost of their next game. Eventually, when and if they manage to produce a lineup of good games, they will become financially solvent. enough to expand their company and be profitable. So in this slide, to the left is the list of top publishers in 2017 by revenue. On top of that list is Tencent, or Tengxun in Chinese, who owns QQ as well as several online games such as League of Legends, also partially owns PUBG. Okay, yes, that is $18.2 billion US dollars. Okay, I'm sure you recognize most of the other names on that list, like Sony, Apple, Microsoft, and Blizzard. To the right are the top mobile publishers. So other than Tencent, the other names are slightly different. You see NetEase or Wang Yi, right? In second place, they own Westward Journey and has partnerships with Blizzard for local versions of many of the Blizzard games. There's also King with Candy Crush, Mixi with Monster Strike, and Supercell with Clash of Clans. It's a big business which shows no signs of slowing. Okay, so that's game publishers who publish games. But the companies that actually develop the games are called game studios, and there are lots of them. When people say that they are working in a game company, they usually mean that they are working in a game studio. Simply put, game studios are companies that develop games. Most of the better known game studios are owned by publishers. So for example, Rockstar, who develops GTA and Red Dead Redemption, right? They are owned by Take-Two Interactive. And BioWare, who did Mass Effect and Dragon Age, is actually owned by EA. Okay? But there are still some prominent studios who are still privately owned, independent companies such as Valve, who did Counter-Strike, Dota, and Half-Life. I just named 3 games. Half-Life 3 confirmed. Game studios usually specialize in specific genres and have an identifiable style, to the point where you just have to name the company that made the game to have an idea of the type of game that you're referring to. So for example, a Rockstar game is likely to be a huge sandbox style game, while a Square Enix game is probably you'll have some Japanese manga sensibilities. And you know that any game made by Zynga will be a casual so-called freemium game with lots of microtransactions. This is because when game studios form a team to develop a game, the members of the team will have certain skills and capabilities. Therefore, it just makes sense to make more games of a similar genre in order to leverage on the skills of their existing employees. As game studios grow and they expand their repertoire, they may form more teams. It is not uncommon for a studio to have multiple teams that specialize in particular genres of games or different platforms. The teams can be full-time employees, contract staff, or interns. And most small companies will outsource at least some of their work, as they may not be able to afford to hire full-time staff to fill certain positions such as sound engineers or language translators. You may have heard stories of some game companies starting off as just a couple of college students working on their game in their spare time. Interestingly, this origin of game companies has affected the working environment of game companies today. It is almost a cliche now that game companies have a more casual working environment than most software companies. There is usually no dress code or formal office conduct. There is frequently no official working hours, and in fact, sometimes there isn't even an office. There are some companies whose development teams consist of people from all over the world working remotely. When there is an office, it is often stocked with free food, beverages, and snacks. Employees will schedule meetings as needed and be able to stay at the office for an extended time if necessary. This is because the key to game development is hitting milestones and checkpoints rather than doing work daily. While this does have an advantage of being very flexible to change, it will lead to a pile of work if the time is not managed properly. This is especially serious as the shipping deadline approaches, which is known as crunch time. You hear a lot of horror stories of people working 80-hour weeks for months, due mainly to bad planning or maybe unforeseen circumstances. Is this a good or bad working environment? That's for you to decide. Here is a list of the top 50 video game studios in an article by GameDesigning.org. There are a lot of famous names here, and if you haven't heard of the company, it's quite likely that you have heard of the games that they make. These companies are based all over the world, including the United States, Europe, China, and Japan, and most have subsidiary offices in multiple countries. Okay. Those were the big boys, the multinational, multi-million dollar companies that make huge games. However, there is another path into game development, which is to produce independent games or indies. These are the games made by a single person or a small team, often by people who met in school and have a shared passion for game development. Like, for example, people who take the game production module at Nanyang Polytechnic School of ICT. The main problem with this model is that you still have to eat, right? While you're developing your game, you either have to have another source of income or get some private investor like friends, relatives, or I don't know, winning the lottery to meet your daily expenses. This is why indie games are often done during the developer's spare time. However, if the game is completed and starts to make money, you can gradually use the profits to fund your next game and so on. Good indie game studios will eventually get noticed, and game publishers will approach them to develop games based on the indie company's IP, which is another source of funding. Finally, game publishers may buy out game companies completely, sometimes for very large sums of money. One of the biggest indie success stories is Minecraft, which was developed by a Swedish programmer named Marcus Persson under his company Mojang, that was bought by Microsoft in 2014 for 2.5 billion US dollars. Other notable successes include Flappy Bird by a solo Vietnamese programmer Nguyen Ha Dong, Angry Birds by Rovio Mobile, and Undertale by one person named Toby Fox. On the other hand, the fact that indies do not have the resources of large game companies does present some definite issues. Notice that most of the successful indie games focus on innovation and creativity, because it is almost impossible to develop a cookie-cutter version of an existing game genre, because the larger companies will outdo the indie in terms of quality. Instead, the successful indie game has to have some innovative gameplay that larger companies may not be inclined to try because of the risk involved in releasing something new. Quite often, indie developers are driven by their passion to develop the game that they themselves want to play, and not necessarily by profit. Complex and involved games on niche topics are likely to be indie because their potential market is small. So here's the thing, the barrier to entry to game development today is very low. It is completely feasible for one person or a small team to develop a game as a hobby and have it published. Many game engines are very cheap or free. For example, Unity 3D Personal is completely free until you earn 100,000 US dollars per fiscal year of your game. And Game Maker Studio 2 is 100 US dollars for a permanent license. These are game engines that have made multiple successful commercial games. In fact, your assignment 2 for GPN requires you to make a game with such a game engine, so you get to experience what it's like to be an indie game developer. Things are also a little easier for indie game developers as online distribution platforms like Steam and App Store are available, so there's no need to actually manufacture physical DVDs. That being said, indie successes are the exception and not the rule. For every Angry Birds, there are 100 Grumpy Cat games that are completely forgotten. If you're in it for the money, look elsewhere. But if there is a game that you really want to make, then make it and join the indie community. In fact, there are many Singapore-based game companies that started out as small indie companies, and some have grown to become reasonably successful. Most of the games are casual games, and here are a few examples. We have Boom Zap Entertainment. This was founded by Alan Simonson and Christopher Natsume, and they make mainly casual mobile games with a bit of depth, like Legends of Kalasia or the Awakening series. The office is almost entirely virtual, with their programmers, designers, and artists working from home across mainly Asia. We have Daylight Studios, founded by ICT alumnus Elwin Lee in 2011. They are known for their Holy Potato series of casual games. We have Gumi SG. They are a subsidiary of Gumi Incorporated and specialize in mobile games like Brave Frontier and Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. And I Got Games, or IGG, is a free gaming platform provider specializing in free-to-play mobile games with in-app purchases such as Lots Mobile and Castle Clash. And yes, there are opportunities for you to get internship positions at these companies. In particular, Alwin at Daylight Studios has taken on multiple ICT students as interns in the past. At this point, you should have a decent idea about game studios. So let's take a moment to answer the following questions. Number one, would you want to work in a major game studio like Ubisoft, Blizzard, or Nintendo? This would mean that you will probably be part of a decent sized team working on some major games, but your individual influence on the game will then be diluted. Is there a major studio that you really want to work for? And if so, which one and why? Or are you someone who prefers to work in a smaller indie game studio where you're working in a lean team of probably fewer than 10 people? So while your inputs will have a much more significant effect on the games that you make, you will have to fill more different roles, and your game will probably have a smaller market share. Or maybe you are someone who doesn't want to work for anyone at all, right? Instead, you're happy to either start your own indie game company or even develop your games all by yourself. If so, what's your strategy? And how will you pay your bills before your efforts pay off? Think about this and write your answers down in the bio section of your e-portfolio. If nothing else, it will be interesting to read in 10 years after you make your first $1 billion from your games. Right. You should now have an idea of what it is that game publishers do and the difference between a game publisher and a game studio, even though many companies fill both roles. You should also have an idea of the indie game movement. And in assignment 2 of game production, you will get a chance to develop your own digital game prototype, just like an independent game developer. Exciting, no?